I'm Seth Killian. We're here at Capcom to talk about the history of the Versus series. So the history of the Versus series technically starts with X-Men versus Street Fighter, but many fighting aficionados, including myself, really date some of the origins back to a game called X-Men Children of the Atom and Marvel Superheroes, which introduced things like chain combos and aerial raves and some crazy super combos and just a big open playfield that was much bigger than like a Street Fighter world. Now the playfield goes up 4 stories instead of being relatively confined and gives you space for that kind of craziness. But all of that led us eventually into X-Men versus Street Fighter, which is the true tag team beginning of the Versus series.
Here you go!
X-Men versus Street Fighter!
So X-Men versus Street Fighter was also a challenge to sort of reimagine some of the Street Fighter combatants, because these guys are basically guys who are sort of good at karate or something, who are now up against gods in many cases with really over-the-top powers. So we saw reimagined versions of Chun-Li and Ryu with instead of just a regular Hadouken, he's got now a super Hadouken that fills the entire screen. So really just leading into the whole craziness of the series and amping up all the characters in new ways and finding ways to make them competitive.
Magnetic Tempest! Nike win!
So in 1997, we had Marvel Superheroes versus Street Fighter, which was sort of the follow-up game. And this expanded the Marvel universe beyond just the X-Men, and the Capcom universe also expanded a little bit to bring in some of the newer Street Fighters like Sakura and Dan. You see some of the X-Men being replaced by some surprising characters like Blackheart and Omega Red, and brought us into a new generation of versus combat. It did introduce some new mechanics into the series, some new ways to bring out your teammate to help you do an assisted move while you're still moving around on point. But ultimately what it really aimed at in terms of mechanics was trying to tone down some of the insanity that we got in X-Men versus Street Fighter. So trying to avoid some of those infinite combos, trying to just sort of rein it in a little bit. And what we discovered very quickly was that's not what people like. That's not fun. So this was really an important milestone, not only as a game, but really as a lesson for the future about insanity is good. Craziness is good. This is the hallmark of this series. Let's keep the focus there. So that brings us to Marvel vs. Capcom, which is really the introduction of the modern era, as we call it. And we've removed any mention of X-Men or Street Fighter or anything like that. Now it's just one corporate logo versus another, which really opened up the floodgates to see all sorts of crazy characters appearing. So we've got crazy characters like Liu, or Colossus is now back as an assist. All sorts of obscure characters that you haven't seen before, Saki, making back appearances, and now establishing this franchise as something that can really pull from anywhere and have a really crazy tag team fight, and also trying to focus on not having just 2-point characters, but now having an assist character to introduce sort of a third dynamic, a third projectile, a third vector of attack to let you move freely on the screen while your opponent's locked down.
We want to eat your brain!
But by having the assists on the screen, it really it gave us the essence of the series in many ways, or what was to develop in the series, which is when you call out an assist, it's basically like an overpowered analog of like Guile throw a sonic boom and then follow it in. Now your sonic boom is a whole other character shooting crazy stuff out there, but while that crazy stuff is shooting out, you're free to fly around the screen and jump in and try and mix them up or go for a throw, which really creates a whole new way to play and a lot of excitement and a lot of fun, free possibilities. Some of those assists included guys like Arthur and Thor, who made cameo appearances as assists, but have now actually made their way into fully playable characters in Marvel vs. Capcom 3. In an attempt to learn our lesson from Marvel Superheroes versus Street Fighter, we tried to think of some of the craziest things that were possible. And we thought, what about having both characters on screen at the same time, and you can control them both, and they have unlimited super meter? And we're like, no, that's stupid. That's too much. But they did it anyway, and that's where we got these duo team attacks. And some of the most powerful teams in the game, we had like War Machine and Gold War Machine, who would shoot out the shoulder cannons and just fill the screen with so many missiles the actual game hardware would slow down and it would start chugging because the entire screen was filled with too many missiles and too many collisions. And whether it hit or not, you'd still take 80% damage just on block. So it was just mental. But that was the fun of the game, is just coming up with new kinds of strategies that nobody had ever thought of before and letting the players be in control. Marvel vs. Capcom 2 came out at the end of the CPS2 arcade era hardware, but we were really swinging for the fences on that one. We said, what can we do? Kitchen sink. You name it. You got a sprite, we're going to throw the sprite in there. Yeah, you're a character in this game. You're a character. Everyone's a character in Marvel vs. Capcom 2. So we took 10, 15 years of sprite history, collected them all into one fighting game, and then gave them all insane moves and properties and just let it all happen. So Marvel vs. Capcom 2's other major innovation was, of course, going from 2 characters with an assist to 3 fully playable characters. But you can call in any of the other characters as an assist. And this was a really genius innovation in many ways, because instead of just spamming on the assist button, and you don't really care what happened in Marvel vs. Capcom, but in 2, you really have skin in the game. So if your assist character gets hit, that's taking life off your actual total life bar, and you can lose the match if you leave an assist vulnerable. So really this opened up a whole new dynamic, not just in terms of having 3 characters, but also making them interact in a way that had never been done before or since by another game. So another major development in Marvel vs. Capcom 2 was a shift away from individual characters to a focus on real team mechanics. So you could talk about strong characters, and there are a handful of really strong characters in Marvel vs. Capcom 2, like Magneto and Storm and Sentinel, that appear on all the teams, but they're complemented by critical assist characters who are not considered necessarily the strongest on their own, but are a critical element of the team. So Magneto and Storm, when you pair them with Psylocke, you've got an amazing team. Right there. Captain Commando, you put him with Sentinel and Cable, amazing team. By himself, not so strong. Together as a unit, amazing. So Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is also just a strange game in a lot of ways. So instead of having recognizable backgrounds we've seen before, now there's a giant clown face in like a theme park that's never been in a Marvel comic or in a Capcom game before. All sorts of nuttiness. You've got characters like Ruby Hart, who's seen her before, Amingo, it's an animated cactus out because his land is dried up, and as well as smooth jazz is the major sort of musical touchstone for the soundtrack. So there's just a lot of nuttiness in here from start to finish. Again, the legacy of Marvel vs. Capcom 2 has been just so amazingly fantastic from a competitive standpoint, and just from the sheer amount of fun that so many players have squeezed out of this game. It was one of my highlights at Capcom when I knew we were going to be able to re-release this game on XBLA and PlayStation Network. And it, of course, sold like hotcakes there. So that was really heartwarming for me to see the enthusiasm for a game that's 10 years old is still super hot. It was the fastest selling game ever on XBLA. And, just the amazing legacy and all the fun is what will always stay for me for Marvel vs. Capcom 2. So again, all these changes were met with some fear, and maybe these games are too crazy, but ultimately it's turned into one of the most amazing legacies in all of competitive gaming. A solid 10 years of just incredible play with people figuring out new characters and new strategies consistently for years and years until they boiled it down to who they thought were the very strongest. But the game has stayed interesting and highly competitive and just kept the fighting scene burning with passion and just amazing, hilarious internet memes and just so much energy from all the players that it's really kept the scene going. And the game itself, as a core game, is so free and fun with possibilities that it's kept it interesting for over a decade as we move into Marvel vs. Capcom 3.
I shall strike you down, Demon Hunter.
I'm not gonna pull my punches.
Live and let die.
So all of that versus history brings us to Marvel vs. Capcom 3 today. And we've really tried our best to learn our lessons from the past. So the emphasis here is going to be on total insanity. We've maintained that 3-on-3 tag mechanic. We've introduced new ways to tag in your opponents. new options for them to do things on the ground and to interact via the team hyper combos. But ultimately, it's just by adding more depth and more fun to all the characters, more personality, really spending a lot of time to try and animate them all beautifully, bring in more comic book touches, and really just round out the vision of Marvel vs. Capcom 2 in a fully realized, beautiful next-gen edition of Marvel vs. Capcom 3. So there you have it, in a nutshell, the history of the Versus series. We've got Marvel and Capcom getting together, starting small, turning into something crazy, a legacy that's brought us now all the way up to Marvel vs. Capcom 3. So if you don't know, now you know.